Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and to Mary Mean and the rest of the staff at NJTPA. Indeed, we've had a decades-long partnership with NJTPA on a variety of topics. I'm super happy to be here today to tell you a little bit about some new work that we're doing. I think that work sort of has resonance for a number of reasons in terms of our current situation relative to emerging from COVID-19, as well as really the intersection of much of the work that NJTPA and you all pursue in terms of the long-range plans for North Jersey, as well as the planning that's being done in a number of places throughout the region and throughout the state. I thought that I would start really first with a kind of quick primer on all the work that the Voorhees Transportation Center does in terms of context. We certainly have had strong partnerships recently with NJTPA and the sub-regional representatives here on topics that are covered by Together North Jersey and in particular the Complete Streets work that we've done. But the Voorhees Transportation Center kind of portfolio of projects is pretty broad and encompassing. We have core expertise and sort of emerging knowledge on a number of different areas, including transportation systems planning and performance. In particular, transit service planning. We do quite a bit of work with New Jersey Transit and other transportation providers throughout the state on topics related to service planning and travel demand management, congestion management, things like that. We have had a fair amount of work in the past on topics related to transportation finance and sustainable funding for transportation, in particular public transit. Much of our work also focuses on the intersection between transportation and land use and the impact of the built environment on travel behavior, things like transit-oriented development, smart growth, community design, pedestrian and bicycle mobility and safety. We've done work nationally as well as in New Jersey on the topic of transportation resilience and the role of transportation in emergencies. We have we're one of the co-facilitators at the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy of the Planning Healthy Communities Initiative, which looks quite often at the intersection of transportation and health and the central role that transportation plays as a social determinant of health outcomes. A lot of our work also intersects with equity and environmental justice. We have developed courses, done research and planning studies related to meeting the transportation needs of traditionally transportation disadvantaged communities and populations, as well as really how to integrate environmental justice in the transportation planning process. More recently, or I guess maybe a decade ago, we were involved in the intersection between transportation, energy, and climate change, and then went on a bit of hiatus, and then have more recently in the last 18 months since the Murphy administration has emphasized climate change, we've been involved in how to sort of reduce emissions and greenhouse gases in the transport sector. And then finally, we are actively involved right now in work on emerging transportation modes and big data analytics, and are developing expertise in both of those areas, and hope to make those a strong part of our portfolio moving forward. So when I had a conversation with Mary and Dave and Jeff about coming to give a talk, we talked about the depth and breadth of all the things that we're doing, and sort of seized upon this the idea of talking about a project that we launched a couple months ago, actually, in partnership with the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance. The Climate Change Alliance has for those of you who are not familiar, has sort of kept the conversation about climate change, its impacts on New Jersey, and the mitigation of greenhouse gas emission issues, energy consumption issues in New Jersey for the better part of going on 2 decades now. They have a bunch of different existing working groups, and we're in the process late last year and early this year of standing up a new transportation work group. And Gene Herb, Margie Kaplan from the Climate Change Alliance, who are my colleagues at Rutgers, came to us and asked us if we could help them in that regard, and help the working group sort of develop a project or an initiative that would add value here in New Jersey to the discussion about how to reduce emissions from the transport sector. And they asked us to think about that in the context of, in particular, the important initiatives happening through the Murphy administration, but also the sort of changing policy dynamics nationally. In particular, the Energy Master Plan, the governor's initiatives related to environmental justice, and recently released climate change resilience strategy, which brought us to thinking about the incredible challenge that the emissions in the transport sector pose to New Jersey, and sort of taking stock in terms of what is happening already in the planning and policy arena, the infrastructure investment arena, et cetera, and what could the transportation working group do to add value? So the targets are enormous in terms of reducing emissions by 2050 by 80%. A large chunk of that has to do with the transportation sector. A full 41% of emissions in New Jersey are from the transportation sector. And Energy Master Plan, when it was released, sort of estimated that in order to achieve the climate targets that the state is setting, might imply the complete elimination of emissions from the transport sector. So a huge challenge, and something will take decades to achieve, but really kind of giving some thought to how the state's currently addressing that challenge, and what kind of gaps the Climate Change Alliance might fill. So there's been a significant attention paid, I'm sure you guys have here at NJTPA as well, to vehicle electrification and making the investments that we need to in terms of expanding and deploying charging infrastructure, the investments we need to encourage people to uptake electric vehicles. And the Murphy administration has done a significant amount of work in that regard in the last couple of years. The BPU has approved the first utility-driven program to build out EV infrastructure with utility providers, PSE&G, Atlantic City Electric, and others announcing programs to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in that regard. And the Murphy administration is also advancing the use of the multi-state Volkswagen settlement, the monies that the state received from that, as well as the RGGI initiative monies that are coming into the state to also invest in electric vehicle infrastructure and various rebate and tax credit programs and things like that. Also allowed EVs to use HOV lanes. So there's a lot going on in that sector, thinking through what infrastructure is needed to promote the use and uptake of electric vehicles. And we didn't think we could really add too much to that discussion and advance that aspect of decarbonizing the transport sector. But we knew that there probably is more to it. There will have to be more to it than just promoting electric vehicles. And I sort of throw this graphic into the presentation. It's something I think is interesting and illustrative. This graphic is from the Institute for Sustainable Transport in Australia, but I think it really illustrates an interesting point that the use of EVs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is sensitive to the mix of electric off-grid power sources. New Jersey pretty well positioned, but there are still emissions from electric vehicles based on how electricity is generated. And also the footprint of what's needed, even if we transitioned 100% of the vehicle fleet in New Jersey to electric vehicles, the footprint of that in terms of infrastructure for parking and roads and et cetera is still quite large. So we thought that perhaps stepping back and thinking about the challenge as not just how do we eliminate or reduce emissions from the transport sector, but really how do we bring about carbon neutral mobility, led us to this idea of thinking about the challenge in terms of emissions from a multi-goal framework. What could we achieve and where are there synergies if we were pursuing healthy, just, efficient, resilient, and carbon neutral mobility, kind of all at the same time. So could we improve health outcomes for people and communities by improving air quality and making it easier and safer to walk and bike? Certainly, EVs can help in that regard, but much more is needed in terms of the built environment and the investments that we need to do to bring about easy and safe walking. Can we promote equity by making travel by transit more reliable, convenient, by enhancing access to opportunity to marginalized groups? Can we increase transportation system efficiency and effectiveness by integrating kind of advanced and emerging transportation technology and modes in New Jersey in a more effective way? Can we make transportation more resilient by enhancing systems and adapting infrastructure to climate hazards? And then finally, can all of those things be advanced while also reducing energy use and emissions of all kinds in terms of the transport sector? And ultimately, I think the project that we've derived, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it, I think actually carbon neutral mobility means all of those things, and we certainly can put in place a framework that helps us to address all of those goals and achieve a carbon neutral future for transportation while also achieving these other goals. So that brought us to this project, and how do we move the state towards a healthier, more equitable and cleaner transport future? And I'm going to sort of break down each of those components of healthy, just, resilient, carbon neutral, and tell you a little bit about what we've figured out in terms of research ongoing and leading practices across jurisdictions in the US and the world relative to each of those things separately. So what is it that we mean by healthy mobility? Certainly healthy mobility means, and we certainly know that transportation affects our lives in many, many ways every day. Transportation largely determines what we have access to and what we don't have access to. So access is an important component of transportation. And actually, access is critically important to individual and community health because access to well-paying jobs and fresh food and needed services, educational opportunities, parks, other amenities shapes health outcomes for all of us. And it's not just access to healthcare. Transportation is one of the largest components of all of those things I just mentioned, and each of those things is a social determinant of health that really affects mortality and disease and things like that across all populations. Healthy mobility also involves safety, something critically important to DOT and JTPA, I know, in terms of your programs. Safety is not just an economic consideration, it certainly is a health consideration. And among unintentional injury deaths consistently in the US and around the world, injuries from car crashes are usually the first or second leading cause of death in all age groups. So very important to health and our communities. Depending on the characteristics and options available, transportation can also significantly encourage physical activity. And we know that, for instance, people that take transit walk more and have better health outcomes. That's been demonstrated through research in New Jersey as well as elsewhere. So things like being able to walk to safe, have an easy and safe walk to transit stops, or having a protected bike lane, encourage physical activity, which has long-term health outcomes that are positive. Transportation is certainly a major source of emissions that causes air pollution, and air pollution is a major cause of heart and lung disease, including cancer, asthma, bronchitis, and others. And finally, transportation has the noise from transportation, particularly highways and airports, can really negatively affect our lives in many ways, including affecting our sleep and hearing quality, stress levels, energy levels, things like that. So there's a lot of research out there that connects transportation and health, and what we think we're evolving into is a framework that will help us to achieve healthy mobility while we're also achieving carbon neutral mobility. The second piece of our long name for our project has to do with just mobility and what it means to have equitable and just mobility. And the sort of consensus in the world of environmental justice and equity advocacy is that mobility really is the freedom of movement and the ease with which people can get where they need to go. Access to mobility options needs to be fair and just, providing everyone with choice in how they travel. An equitable and just transportation system provides safe and clean transportation options that are affordable, convenient, and easy to use. And equitable mobility provides really the same, should provide the same opportunity for everyone to move around reliably and sustainably in ways that meet their needs. So equity in transportation and an equitable mobility system includes lots of options, and options that are safe, affordable, convenient, and easy to use. And as you'll see, and as you can imagine, being able to walk and bike safely, being able to take public transportation, having access to shared use mobility options, things like that, really are important considerations as well to bringing about carbon neutral mobility. The resilient part of mobility, this one is a little harder to grasp, because I think we often think about resilience in transportation in terms of the impacts of climate on infrastructure itself, and that certainly is part of it, an important part of it. But in terms of resilient mobility, systems need to be robust. They need to be well conceived and constructed and managed in order to withstand those impacts from hazard events, kind of that traditional thinking about how infrastructure is prepared to respond to climate hazards, weather hazards without significant damage or loss of function, that kind of thing. But it also includes redundancy. Systems should have spare or latent capacity that's purposefully created within those systems so that they can accommodate disruption and extreme pressure and surges in demand and things like that when they do occur. So diversity in systems helps to contribute to that redundancy. Again, multiple modes, having travel options and alternative routes that fulfill whatever given function needs to be undertaken. And we saw, I think, this quite vividly in the pandemic, where it was critically important for all of us to have multiple ways of getting somewhere. If like we thought for some period of time, public transportation was potentially an opportunity to spread the disease. Turns out research has indicated that has largely not been public transportation has largely not been the spreader of the disease, but so that we can meet our needs by perhaps walking and biking to the places we need to go. or having other options. So that redundancy in the systems is really important. Systems should be flexible in order to sort of change, evolve, and adapt to changing circumstances, either emergent circumstances or the evolution of circumstances. Resilient mobility also really relies on having responsive infrastructure systems. I know intelligent transportation systems and the technology and transportation operations and management are very important to DOT and JTPA and other transportation providers. But making sure that our systems incorporate the kind of monitoring and data we need to get feedback in the short term and have the ability to kind of understand how systems are performing in real time and modifying operations and emerging conditions. And then finally, resilient mobility requires coordination between systems. Coordination between power ensuring that our signals and have redundant power sources, perhaps during times when power is out, or making sure that other interdependencies are accounted for as we're planning and maintaining and operating our systems. And then certainly also consistency in decision-making and management of those systems so that they're all mutually supportive and we're making decisions that are moving us toward a shared outcome. So lots of research in all of these areas, and we're presently in the process of thinking through, how all of these important goals of future mobility system kind of relate together. And I'll tell you in a minute about how we're kind of exploring that in terms of the geography of New Jersey's landscapes. And then finally, carbon neutral mobility, which really means that we are being smart about the combinations that bring about combinations of a wide range of different types of measures, investments, things like that include everything from energy efficient vehicles and electric transport, like I was describing before, but also really thinking about the best deployment of shared use travel options, affordable, convenient, and efficient public transportation. Maybe we need to do some rethinking of how we provide public transport. New Jersey Transit's working on that in Newark and in Camden, will be in other places as well. We need to have safe walking and biking environments and sustainable power generation. So achieving carbon neutral mobility requires us really to have smart combinations of all of these things so that we can reduce vehicle miles traveled by private autos, especially those powered by gas and diesel. And we can increase the share of trips taken by non-auto modes. So these are long-term kind of goals that we have that are sort of taking on increased significance in the context of bringing about carbon neutrality in the transport sector and carbon neutral mobility. So all of that kind of learning and thinking led us to a set of guiding concepts that are really the foundation for the project that we're undertaking right now. If the objective is to decarbonize the transportation sector, then we need to support a transition to low and no emissions vehicle use, that's for sure, including all types of vehicles, whether that be public or private, light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles, or public transit vehicles, or carbon neutral or decarbonized maritime and aviation sectors. But we also need to do other things that help to empower people to drive less by making it easier and safer to walk and bike. We need to plan for lots of connections within and between neighborhoods, communities, within the regional structure. Active transportation is a low-cost way to improve people's physical and mental health, as well as to reduce vehicle miles traveled, noise, and air pollution. So walking and biking, a win across a lot of these multifaceted goal structures. We need to create a diverse and inclusive network of neighborhoods by encouraging neighborhoods that are mixed in terms of housing types and affordability. I know that the topic of accessory dwelling units has resonance in all parts of New Jersey right now. We also need to ensure that our land uses are built at densities where appropriate to sort of cost effectively support shared modes and public transit. We need to think harder about how mobility as a service and that concept of kind of moving away from providing individual transportation services to thinking about mobility and it being in and of itself a service, and reimagining how public transportation worked with a focus more on customer needs and the needs of individual trips, and giving people convenient, affordable, and efficient travel options. We certainly need to embrace new technologies, but we need to ensure that they're affordable and accessible to everyone. That means really deliberate planning and investment in infrastructure and providing incentives that are needed to bring about an electric, shared, and eventually autonomous vehicle future, but doing it in a way that is, as I said, deliberate and intentional relative to making sure that all of us have access to those things, and not just those that can afford them. And then finally, we think it's really important to make social justice a key indicator of transportation performance, not just a consideration of whether or not we're complying with environmental justice requirements, but really to elevate social justice as a really important performance measure for the future, so that we're connecting people with opportunity, we're eliminating transportation-related health impacts, environmental impacts to marginalized communities all at the same time. So that sort of framework of guiding concepts for our projects led us to thinking about how do we organize that work to understand what the best ways are to achieve those multiple goals given New Jersey's landscape. And in order to kind of operationalize those concepts and really ground truth them to the geography of New Jersey, we're using this idea of a 15-minute city or a 15-minute neighborhood as the kind of possible organizing framework to explore what it might take to achieve the vision of a healthy, just, resilient, and carbon neutral mobility in the state. And there are sort of growing number of examples. This concept has had significant attention in the post-pandemic or emerging post-pandemic world, given the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on people's lives and how we travel and things like that. And there are an increasing number of examples around the world, including Singapore, Paris, Portland in the United States, Melbourne, Ottawa, Barcelona, where communities have been using this concept as a way to kind of frame up their planning. And in fact, Hudson County, I know, I think late last month and moving into this month and perhaps into June, is sponsoring a webinar series to think about how the 15-minute city or 15-minute neighborhood concept applies to Hudson County and how it can help us sort of build our communities back better after the pandemic. So what is this idea of a 15-minute city or neighborhood? What do we really mean by that? And it seems like from the research and the examples that we've explored, including all of those international studies that are international examples that I just mentioned, the definitions are different depending on the locations. They're all fundamentally the same, but seemingly flexible. And the flexibility derives from the mix of transportation modes that you include in this kind of conceptual framework. With the graphic here that I'm showing on the screen, prepared by Andreas Dewani and Robert Stewartville from the Congress of New Urbanism, kind of shows that flexibility. So you could think about a 5-minute walk, you could think about a 15-minute walk, you could think about a 5-minute bike ride or a 15-minute bike ride. You could even think about a 15-minute transit ride between different neighborhoods or a 15-minute car ride. But really, the basic definition is that a 15-minute geography should be able to allow us to meet most of our human needs and many of our desires within that 15-minute travel distance. So that's kind of the basic definition of what a a 15-minute city or neighborhood is. And we're using that concept to explore the relationships between and look at the geography of people and places and the connections between people and places in different parts of the state, to see what kind of patterns emerge, to think about what the reality was during the pandemic, but also to think about the future in terms of bringing about a carbon neutral mobility pattern. So we're using that concept also sort of flexibly at different scales to help us think about or rethink the relationships between neighborhoods, how neighborhoods come together to form communities, and then how communities relate to one another in a larger regional context. So really, if you think about a 15-minute neighborhood being a building block, multiple neighborhoods come together, and there are connections between them. And then those multiple, they form a community, and then communities come together in a region to play different functions. They have different forms. But if we think about this the overall concept of 15 minutes to get places, either at the neighborhood scale or 15 minutes to get between places at the regional scale, can that help us imagine what the policy interventions that we need to make are and what the infrastructure investments we need to make are in New Jersey to kind of bring about an environment where people can walk more, walk and bike more, they can drive less, they can use public transportation in ways that they perhaps can't currently based on the existing connections and that sort of thing. So we're doing that in our first phase of work is looking at case study locations throughout the state, 4 of which happen to be in the NJTBA region. So we're looking at, we did our first phase of work was doing some desktop analysis, data collection analysis, et cetera, of patterns in Essex, Hudson, Middlesex, and Warren counties. And all of these places, including those outside the NJTBA region, were all selected in consultation with the Transportation Work Group at the Climate Alliance. And they were all selected to hopefully give us a good selection of places that have different issues, different transportation contexts, different economic development contexts, different densities, different land uses, different equity issues, different patterns of marginalized populations, that sort of thing. So each of these case studies are kind of the starting point for our analyses. And our phase 1 work is looking at what the leading practices are in terms of those things that I've described for you already, in terms of the overall vision. We've collected and are finishing some analysis and mapping of the patterns of people, place, and connections in each of the counties. We're in the process of identifying potential equity partners with this idea that social justice should be a key performance metric for this kind of new vision of carbon neutral mobility in New Jersey. And I'll tell you in a minute or so, we're also be convening a thought leaders issue forum in the sort of late June, early July timeframe. All of that will be foundational for phase 2 and phase 3 of our work, which will kind of extend throughout the rest of this year, maybe a little bit into next year, where we'll be conducting field work and community engagement over the summer, early fall, and then coming up with concept plans for at least 3, hopefully 6 neighborhood scale investigations to look at all of the things that I've described so far at the neighborhood level, with a particular focus on better connecting low-income areas, census blocks, neighborhoods, with opportunities through a variety of modes, and improving the pedestrian and bicycle environment in those communities, and improving connections between those communities where other opportunities exist elsewhere in the region. So that's going to be sort of a multi-scale look at how we can bring about a more healthy, just, and resilient and carbon neutral mobility pattern in the future. So next steps for the project include continuing to complete and finalize a concept paper that will describe the kind of current state of practice related to planning for healthy, just, resilient, and carbon neutral mobility. We'll be completing our phase 1 analyses that I just described and preparing some existing condition reports for those 8 counties. And those documents will be used as a foundation for the first issues forum, which will include thought leaders from around the state, including local officials, county and municipal officials, and potential equity partners from each of the case study counties. The forums, we plan to organize the forum kind of similar to a visioning workshop. We'll probably have a plenary section where we're exploring some of the ideas that I just described in more detail with some speakers, and then we'll have breakout sessions where we give the participants an opportunity to explore the various components of the multi-goal framework that I've presented today, along with the guiding concepts. And participants will be asked then to help us to identify within that framework needs and concerns in specific places, what the desired long-term outcomes are from a community perspective, what the performance measures should be, including measures related to social justice, and what the potential obstacles and impediments are to achieving that vision of a healthy, just, resilient, carbon neutral mobility in the state. We're currently planning the forum, like I said, for end of June or early July. We'll certainly make sure to invite all of the members of the board and their staff to attend. And we'll certainly also look forward to coming back perhaps end of this year or early next year to tell you a bit about and share some of the results and the recommendations that we come up with from this project. But I think there's a significant convergence of the things that we're exploring through this project and the work that NJTPA does every day, as well as the work of what's important in your long-range transportation plan, as well as the plans of many other state agencies, including New Jersey Transit and DOT. So I look forward to kind of working with all of you and sharing the results in hopefully not too far from now. But I thank you very much for your time. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that might arise or just hear your observations and comments about what I presented.
Does the board have any questions that they'd like to present to Mr. Carnegie?
This is Jason Cernoski from Warren County. I just want to thank John for the presentation and also say that I'd be very interested to see the results of Warren County's study when you're completed. So looking forward to getting together.
Great. Look forward to speaking with you.